Hello, welcome to From Caracas. I'm Laura Prada, and in this opportunity, we'll be talking with Ajamu Baraka, who is an executive member of the Executive Committee of the U.S. Peace Council and also national organizer of the Black Alliance for Peace in the United States. Welcome, Baraka.
My pleasure to be here.
I want to know your experience here in Venezuela in this crucial moment in times where the country is being attacked directly by foreign forces. What have been your experience here so far, and what have you seen?
Well, we came into the country on Sunday, and that was right in the middle of the blackout. And as we were discussing off camera, it seemed like a proper welcome for a committee of individuals from the U.S. and Canada who were here in solidarity with the Venezuelan people, for us to experience firsthand and to see firsthand the consequence of this kind of criminal attack. Now, our position is that, unless proven otherwise, this blackout was the consequence of a nefarious criminal attack by one source, or emanating from one source, and that is the United States of America. It makes no sense that there could be a national blackout in that way, and with the evidence that we've seen thus far that suggests that it was an attack that took advantage of some of the vulnerabilities of the electrical grid here in this country. So it was a political attack, an attack that, according to international law, is a criminal attack. So we experienced that on Sunday and Monday. We've had a chance to meet with a number of organizations and individuals, including the foreign minister from Venezuela, to begin the process of getting an assessment of the consequences of not only the cyber attack, but the sanctions and the impact on the Venezuelan people. Sanctions that are objectively violations of international law and international human rights law. So we've been gathering information that we believe will enhance our ability to go back and tell the story of what is unfolding here in this country.
We must remember our audience that you came here to Venezuela in the middle of the national blackout that hit Venezuela since Thursday the 8th until this last Wednesday.
Yes.
Because that's been an experience. Tell me, what have you seen in those days that the blackout affected the country? How did you saw the people of Venezuela reacting? What was your impression on how the government reacted to facilitate the immediate resolution of this?
Well, we saw that, of course, the government was concerned, because you have people who are now in a situation where the basic needs for human beings are now being undermined. I mean, the basic need for water, for example, the ability to safeguard your food through refrigeration. All of these were impacted by this blackout. So we saw that, but what we also saw was the spirit of the people. When we went to the community today, the message from the people of Katia was that they are in resistance, and that they're not going to allow their spirit to be broken. They're not going to give up their support for this process.
You were speaking about your experience in your visit to this community in Katia, but you were also talking to me about the resistance you've seen these days in the Venezuelan people.
Yes.
As you know, some years ago, the Latin American Caribbean countries, they signed this proclaim saying that Latin America and the Caribbean is a zone of peace. How that that regional will of defending the peace of this region also combines with the fight for the defense of the human rights. Is peace also human rights from your perspective for the Peace Committee?
Yes. Peace is fundamental to the realization of human rights. Human rights are indivisible. They are not only the right to speak, to have access to information, to participate in the electoral process, but they also include the right to housing, the right to medicine, the right to education, the right to dignity as an elder. These rights cannot be separated. So when you have a situation like what we have here in Venezuela, where you have sanctions being imposed on a sovereign nation that makes it difficult for it to protect the fundamental rights of its citizens, the right to housing, the right to health care, the right to clean water. These are violations of human rights. So the ideal that war should be eliminated in order to realize human rights is front and center of what we are fighting for. The idea that the Americas should be a zone of peace is a very important one. It has the ideal that the only way we can realize human rights is within the context of peace. So, you know, the ideal that there are nations that are joining aggressive military alliances like NATO undermines that commitment to making the Americas a zone of peace. And we see the consequence. We see that the U.S. and Europe are working through their so-called global partner, NATO global partner in Colombia, in a very belligerent and aggressive way, with the real possibility of some type of intervention using some of those forces. So this kind of activity undermines that very high and broad and principled position to make Latin America and the Caribbean a zone of peace.
In that fight for defending that zone of peace, it's been very important for Latin America the support of the peace movement and also what small communities in the U.S. have done with their solidarity movements. How is that relationship between the solidarity movements and the Peace Committee in the U.S. with Latin America, specifically with Venezuela?
Well, it's all interconnected. That we stand in solidarity with the people of Venezuela and Latin America for a political goal. That goal is to create the conditions in which we all can live as human beings, free of war, free of material want, free of aggression, free of destabilization. So the solidarity and the peace agenda are connected. It says that the only way we're going to be able to realize these things is as a consequence of the political will of the people. When these states engage in militarism, aggression, the only counter force that we have are the people. So solidarity has to have a grounding and a vision. And that vision is the possibility of peace in this region, the possibility of transcending the states that we have in place now that are not addressing the real needs of the people, the possibility of building a new world. So these concepts and principles are fundamentally interrelated.
Solidarity, anti-imperialism, aren't those the kind of attitudes that capitalism used to define that is socialism? When people want to help the others in need, when they fight those who are abusing or using their influence, their power to put the others on their knees. Why? Why those attitudes, which are simply human attitudes, and which are very simple. Why they are seen like that?
Well, you know, it's interesting. They're attitudes, but they also spring from an ethical framework, an alternative ethical framework from the terms you use, capitalism and imperialism. The ethical framework that we have to ground our struggles in is one in which we see solidarity, human solidarity, collective action as a fundamental principle. Where we see the right to have health care as a fundamental principle. The notion that we don't have to be in competition with each other as individuals or nations is a fundamental alternative principle. So the principles that animate the idea of socialism are the kinds of principles that we have to fight for. The principles that say that one nation should not be in a position to exploit and to oppress another nation, that we should have international cooperation. So we are not apologetic at all in embracing those principles, embracing that ethical framework, those values that says that these values reflect a higher humanity, a higher commitment to what our real potential is really able to realize.
Talking about those principles and the relationship that's why they forge, they make stronger that relationship between peace movements, solidarity movements, and the people of Venezuela, of other countries in Latin America, like we can say also, I don't know, Cuban people also. Men like Chavez, like Fidel Castro, for instance, but many other leaders here in the region have also defended that relationship, that brotherly relation, and also they have called to, in a way, to make a closer bond between the African American community and other small communities in the U.S. How has that relation forged through the years?
Well, those relationships have been very important. Fidel Castro, Hugo Chavez have understood that in the context of the United States, for example, the African American movement has been very important. That movement is a movement that embraced the principles we talked about a moment ago, including the principles of internationalism. So that's part of building the regional-wide solidarity. That solidarity has to include all peoples, the indigenous, the African people, everyone, animated by this vision of what we can be collectively. So those leaders had that vision. The movements that they helped to build reflected that vision. It's really up to us to continue that process of building organizations that will help us to build the popular power that we need to ultimately realize those visions. So the African American struggle that we're involved in helping to organize in the United States with the Black Alliance for Peace is a very important part of that process. The Black Alliance for Peace is an organization, an alliance that is committed to organizing black people, but beyond black people. Is committed to building a new human rights and anti-imperialist, anti-war movement in a broad sense. But we understand that every sector has to be organized, and that's what we're in fact trying to do.
There are countries in the world, like United States, that promotes war.
Yes.
In the peace movement, how do you work to make conscious that war is not an option, to make people understand that war is not an option, and to defend that peace to be kept?
Well, it's a challenge because in the United States, for example, war and aggression has become so normalized that people accept it almost as common sense. They don't even recognize when they're being manipulated into supporting war. One of the consequences of this kind of activity is that they don't then make it a requirement to understand what their state, what their government is involved in. They don't understand the kind of suffering that their state is involved in their name. So what we have to do is try to make visible what the United States is in fact involved in, and to help people to understand that the interests that they are advancing, because they're not just involved in military action because they're just bad people. They are protecting and advancing a set of interests. The interests they are advancing and protecting are the interests of the 1% of the ruling elite. And so we have to try to get people to a point where they understand that what they define as the so-called national interest is not the interest of the people. So it's a process of organizing and educating. It's a difficult one, but it's one in which we can't avoid. It's the only tool that we have left to us.
Now, keeping that thought, what we are seeing now that it's happening in Venezuela, they're acts of war, direct attacks that our U.S. is directing to Venezuela. Do you think is there a possible military intervention, that the war takes place here, that, or not here, but in the region? And what would a change of government, an imposed change of government in Venezuela would be like?
Well, first we want to make sure that we understand that a war situation already exists. When you impose sanctions that have the consequence of people losing their lives, where a government is no longer able to support itself and to pursue its own interests, where we see the kind of suffering that has been a consequence of these sanctions, undermining currency. This is a war situation. What we don't want to evolve, though, is a more direct military conflict, because then you have real bloodshed in a very massive and dramatic way. So our job is not even to think about what could happen if there's that kind of military conflict. Our responsibility is to try to avoid that happening. And that's why we are here. That's why we are going back to the U.S. to educate people and to compel them to understand what their government is doing and the consequences it's having on real live human beings.
Taking that thought also into consideration now, in the last month, in the opposition concentrations, we were able to see flags, foreign flags. But it was very significant that the flags that the people were carrying the most, besides the Venezuelan, were U.S. and Israel. Why? Why? I mean, usually we've seen in opposition marches the U.S. Flag, but now we see, besides the U.S. flag, Israel's flag. Why is that? Why? Where that influence? Where is that coming from? Why?
That's a very interesting question, something that I think Venezuelans have to really grapple with. I think from our perspective, from the outside, it suggests that these forces that are trying to suggest that they are the legitimate leaders of this nation really don't have the best interests of this nation at heart. That they in fact represent foreign forces, that they are prepared to even invite a foreign military into their own nation, knowing that the patriotic military forces of this country are going to defend the territory, resulting in the loss of life of Venezuelan army personnel. So it suggests to us from the outside that these are forces that are not patriotic. They in fact represent the interests of external forces, and that should be something that the people in this country really grapple with. That you know, the cyber attacks that seem to be invited and praised by the opposition, that's resulting in real suffering. That from our perspective, should negate these individuals even being considered to be Venezuelans.
From the peace movement, from your position, which is the call you make today for those who are attacking Venezuela, to the people of Venezuela? What do you tell them from your position, from being member of the executive committee of the peace movement?
Well, from the point of view of the U.S. Peace Council and the Black Alliance for Peace, we say stand strong, understand that the people of the world are with you. We say that you should remind the U.S. that they were concerned about humanitarian interventions and humanitarian concerns. They should address those concerns to Yemen, a situation in which they created that is recognized as the most egregious humanitarian issue on the planet. They should ask the U.S. How far it's gone to repair its colony in Puerto Rico. We say, if you're concerned about the democracy, what about the democracy of the Palestinians? So we say, speak truth to power, understand that most of the world is with this country. Most of a majority of the nations recognize the elected government. But one last thing that we have to begin to really understand, it may be a painful one for many people. We see a solidarity, if you will, among these oppressive states. And these oppressive states are what we call in the Black Alliance for Peace the axis of domination, the U.S., the EU, and NATO. So it appears that the northern nations, the U.S. and Europe and Canada, have decided that they're going to struggle and fight to maintain their dominance, a dominance that started in 1492 with the invasion of the Americas, that they're prepared to fight to the last drop of your blood and mine to maintain that dominance. So we've got to recognize that this issue of war is not only a class issue, it is also a national and a race issue. And that's a very important element that we have to really understand.
Thank you, Ajamu.
Thank you so much
for speaking with us from Caracas, for agreeing to meet us and to explain to us, to our audience, how it's important for the world, how much it means the peace, how much peace means for the world. Exactly. So we've come to the end of this from Caracas, where we spoke with Ajamu Baraka, who is executive member of the Committee of the U.S. Peace Council and the national organizer of the Black Alliance for Peace. This has been from Caracas, so until next time.